I was standing in a room full of people who shared my blood, and not one of them would look me in the eye. Welcome back to the Family Revenge Tales. My name is Savannah Pierce, and I want to tell you about the day I found out what my grandfather really thought of me. Not what my father said, not what my brother believed, what my grandfather knew and had known for years, while the rest of us were too busy being cruel to notice. I hadn't been invited to that room. My grandfather, Walter Pierce, had died 6 days earlier, and the family had made it very clear over the past 14 years that I was no longer someone who got invited to things. But my Aunt Carolyn called me the night before, her voice low like she was breaking a rule just by dialing my number, and she said, "Savannah, honey, you should be there tomorrow, whatever anyone else says." I didn't ask her why. I think some part of me already knew Walter had left me something, even if it turned out to be nothing more than a kind word written down somewhere. I needed to hear it, whatever it was. So I drove 2 hours from Boise to my father's attorney's office in a suit I hadn't worn since my discharge ceremony. And I sat down in a chair at the very end of a long conference table, as far from my father as the room would allow. Richard Pierce didn't say hello to me. He didn't say anything at all. He just looked at me the way you'd look at a stain on a shirt you thought you'd already gotten out, and then he turned back to the attorney, like I wasn't there. My brother Logan was worse. He smiled at me, that easy, practiced smile he used on clients and reporters, and he said, "Didn't expect to see you slumming it in a room this nice, Savannah. You still driving that truck with the company logo on the door?" "Every day," I said. "Best decision I ever made." He laughed like I told a joke. Nobody else laughed with him. Nobody defended me either. I want to back up, because you need to understand how we got to that room and why 14 years of silence sat between my father and me like a wall neither of us had tried to tear down. I grew up in a house where love came with conditions, and the biggest condition was that you wanted what my father wanted. Richard Pierce built Pierce Development Group from nothing into one of the most respected commercial construction and real estate firms in the state. And by the time I was in high school, he had already decided exactly what my future looked like. Business degree, corner office, a desk with my name on a brass plate right down the hall from his. He never asked me if that was what I wanted. He assumed it, the way he assumed the sun would come up. But I didn't want a desk. I wanted to build things with my hands. I wanted steel-toed boots instead of high heels and blueprints instead of quarterly reports. I loved watching a building go up from a hole in the ground, loved the noise and the sawdust and the honest tiredness of a real day's work. My father called it a phase. Then he called it an embarrassment. Then, at the company's 25th anniversary celebration in front of employees and clients and people I'd known my whole life, he said the words that ended our relationship. "From this day forward, I have one child." I remember the silence after he said it. I remember Logan looking down at his plate instead of looking at me. I remember walking out of that ballroom with every eye in the room on my back, and I remember that I did not cry until I was alone in my car in the parking lot. That night, I packed one duffel bag. By sunrise, I had walked into a recruiter's office and enlisted in the Army Corps of Engineers. For almost 10 years, I helped build bridges and schools and clinics in places that had lost everything, from flood zones in the Midwest to villages overseas that needed clean water and a roof that wouldn't collapse in the next storm. I learned how to lead people who were scared and tired and still had to get the job done. I learned what it meant to build something that outlasted you. And when I finally came home, I used everything the Army taught me to start Forge and Field Construction, a small commercial construction company outside Boise, Idaho, that hires veterans and skilled tradespeople who other companies overlook. It isn't Pierce Development Group. It never will be. But every nail in every building we've ever put up, I'm proud of. My name disappeared from the family photographs somewhere in those 14 years. I stopped being invited to holidays. My father never called, not once, not even when I was deployed somewhere he could have easily found out about if he'd wanted to. But my grandfather never stopped. Walter Pierce was Richard's father, and he was nothing like him. Where my father needed control, Walter needed only truth. Every few months, without my father ever knowing, I would drive out to Walter's old woodworking barn outside Eagle, Idaho, and we would sit together over coffee that was always a little too strong, surrounded by sawdust and half-finished furniture, and we would just talk. He never once tried to talk me out of my life. He asked about my crews, about the bridges I'd helped rebuild, about the calluses on my hands like they were medals. He taught me things my father never had patience for, things about leadership and patience, and why, in his words, builders always outlast the people who only ever learned how to collect money. The last time I saw him, maybe 8 months before he passed, he set down his coffee mug and looked at me for a long moment before he said, "One day, Savannah, you're going to have to build something a lot bigger than a construction company." I told him I didn't know what that meant. He just smiled and told me I would when the time came. I thought he meant a bigger project. I didn't understand until much later that he meant my whole future. So there I was, back in that conference room, listening to the attorney read through the will Walter had left behind, and everything unfolded exactly the way everyone expected. My father inherited the ranch, the land Walter had lived on for 50 years. Logan inherited full controlling ownership of Pierce Development Group, the company he'd been groomed to run since he was a teenager. Aunts, uncles, and cousins received generous cash inheritances, enough to change any of their lives if they'd needed changing. And then the attorney reached the last envelope. "For Savannah Pierce," he said, and slid a thin, weathered envelope down the table to me. Inside, there was no check, no deed, no stock certificate, just an old brass key, a storage unit number written on an index card, and a single handwritten sentence in my grandfather's careful print. "Every great legacy begins by opening the right door. Walter." Logan lost it. He actually laughed out loud, a real laugh, head back and everything. "A storage locker key," he said. "That's incredible. Grandpa really said, 'I'll leave the black sheep a storage unit,' and meant it." A few of my cousins laughed with him. My father didn't laugh. He didn't say anything at all. He just looked away from me, the same way he had for 14 years. And I noticed something in that moment I hadn't expected to notice. His jaw was tight, and his hands, folded on the table, were gripping each other a little too hard for a man who was supposed to be satisfied with a ranch. I closed the envelope. I stood up. And before I walked out, I said the only thing I had to say to any of them. Grandpa never wasted a single word. Nobody stopped me as I left. I don't think anyone in that room understood what they'd just watched happen. I didn't go home that night. I drove straight to the storage facility on the edge of Boise, the brass key sitting on the passenger seat like it was something alive. The unit was small and easy to miss, tucked at the end of a long row of identical metal doors, and when I finally got the lock open and rolled the door up, I stood there for a long moment just staring. It was like walking into a different version of my life, one that had been running quietly this whole time without me knowing. There were shelves of records, architectural blueprints rolled and labeled by year, old family photographs I hadn't seen since I was a child, and stacks of handwritten journals in Walter's handwriting. There were construction models of buildings I didn't recognize, and on the far wall, hanging in careful rows, were 47 birthday cards, still sealed, every one addressed to me. One for every birthday since the night my father disowned me. My hands were shaking by the time I opened the first one. Walter had written inside every single one, telling me about the seasons on the ranch, asking about jobs he'd heard I was working, telling me he was proud of me in ways he never got the chance to say out loud. He had written to me every year. My father had simply made sure none of them were ever delivered. I was still standing there, holding 47 years of a love I never knew I had, when a voice behind me said, "He wanted you to find those first." I turned around to find an older man in a flannel shirt leaning against a workbench like he'd been waiting there for a while. He introduced himself as Hank Mercer, Walter's construction partner and closest friend for almost 40 years. "I've been coming by this unit every week since he passed, waiting for you to show up. He said you would, eventually. He said you always finish what you start." "What is all this, Hank?" He smiled, and it was a tired, gentle kind of smile. "This is the part of your grandfather nobody else ever got to see." Hank explained that years before anyone in the family realized it, Walter had quietly built a second company, entirely separate from Pierce Development Group. He called it Summit Ridge Capital. Commercial properties, medical office parks, industrial developments. Hundreds of acres of land, acquired slowly and privately over decades, funded entirely outside the family business, structured so cleanly that not even his own attorneys realized how large it had grown. The next morning, I sat across from a corporate attorney named Victoria Sloan, watching her review a stack of documents, thick enough to need its own briefcase. When she finally looked up at me, she said, "Ms. Pierce, as of yesterday, you are the sole owner of a company currently valued at just under $47 million. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt like I couldn't breathe. The brass key had never been the inheritance. It had only ever been the door. Word got out fast, the way it always does in families like mine. Within a week, my father was furious, and Logan had already hired a team of expensive corporate attorneys threatening to challenge the entire thing in court. They claimed Walter hadn't been in his right mind when he set it up. They claimed I had manipulated a dying old man. They promised to bury me and Summit Ridge Capital both. I wasn't afraid, because Walter had never once done anything without thinking 3 steps ahead of everyone else. Inside a locked steel blueprint tube in that storage unit, Hank showed me the rest of what Walter had left behind. Original land contracts, independent medical evaluations conducted years apart, proving without question that Walter's mind had been sharp until the day he died, and pages and pages of Walter's own handwritten notes, quietly documenting how Logan had spent years buying up valuable land through shell companies, then reselling it back to Pierce Development Group at wildly inflated prices and pocketing the difference. Millions of dollars disappeared, one land deal at a time. Walter had known. He'd known for years. He had simply waited for the right person to be able to use the truth without letting it turn into cruelty. Instead of meeting Logan's lawyers in a courtroom, I asked the whole family to come to the ranch. Walter's dining room, the same table where 3 generations of Pierces had made every important decision about the family's future. I unrolled Walter's original development maps across that table, and beside them I laid out the corporate agreements, the medical evaluations, the land records, and the financial audits Victoria had helped me pull together. Nobody in that room said a word while I did it. "You wanted to challenge Grandpa's competency," I said, looking at Logan. "So I brought you 3 separate medical evaluations done over 6 years that say otherwise. And since we're bringing in outside professionals, I also brought an audit of every piece of land Pierce Development Group has purchased in the last 8 years. Logan's face went pale before I even finished the sentence. I told them all what Walter had documented: the shell companies, the inflated resale prices, the money that had quietly vanished from a company my own father trusted his son to protect. My father looked at Logan like he was seeing a stranger sitting in his son's chair. I could have destroyed Logan that day. I had everything I needed to. Instead, I made him one offer: withdraw every lawsuit, resign from Pierce Development Group immediately, repay every dollar he had taken in full, verified by independent audit. In exchange, no criminal charges, no prison, no public scandal. Grandpa believed people deserved one real chance to choose honesty, I told him. I'm giving him his chance, not mine. Logan took it. He didn't have another option. And somewhere underneath all that anger, I think a part of him was relieved. My father didn't say much that day, but a few weeks later, he showed up at Forge and Field, standing awkwardly near the entrance in a suit that looked out of place next to the work trucks. He didn't apologize, not really, not in the way I used to dream he would, but he said something I never expected to hear from him. Your grandfather used to tell me I built a company. He never once told me I built a legacy. I think I finally understand what he meant by the difference. I didn't need him to say more than that. I think some wounds don't close with an apology. They close slowly, with time, and with people showing up differently than they used to. Months later, I became CEO of Summit Ridge Capital while still keeping Forge and Field construction growing alongside it. I brought back employees who had been quietly pushed out of Pierce Development Group over the years for refusing to look the other way on Logan's deals. And instead of chasing bigger luxury developments the way Logan always had, I started something Walter had once described to me in that woodworking barn, without either of us knowing yet that I'd be the one to build it. We called it the Walter Pierce Legacy Initiative, and its first project was an entire neighborhood of affordable homes built for veterans, teachers, nurses, and firefighters right outside Boise. 1 year after that will reading, I stood at the entrance of that finished neighborhood, watching families move boxes into homes they never thought they'd be able to afford, kids already chasing each other across new front lawns. The sign at the entrance read, Walter's Crossing. At the small ribbon-cutting ceremony, I placed my grandfather's old carpenter's hammer inside a glass display case at the community center. The same hammer he let me hold when I was young enough to think it was just a toy. I rested my hand on the worn wooden handle and said, to nobody and everybody at once, people think my grandfather left me almost $50 million. I paused, and I meant every word of what came next. They couldn't be more wrong. He left me something far more valuable. He left me the courage to build what everyone else believed I could never become. If there is one person watching this tonight who feels like the disappointment in their own family, like the one who never fit the mold everyone else was cut from, I want you to hear this clearly. The people who truly see your worth are rarely the loudest voices in the room. Sometimes they are quiet, patient, and willing to wait years to prove it. Never let someone else's limited vision of you become the only mirror you look into. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that character will always outlast greed, please subscribe to the Family Revenge Tales so you never miss the next story of betrayal, justice, and the families who found their way back to the truth. Share it with someone who needs to hear tonight that being different from your family was never your weakness. It was always your strength. And whatever door you're standing in front of tonight, wherever it leads, have the courage to open it. Your legacy was never about what someone else decided to give you. It was always about what you choose to build. What is the significant educational or other value in this story? This story carries an important lesson about the true meaning of legacy and self-worth. It teaches viewers that a person's value is never determined by the approval of family members who prioritize image, control, or material success over genuine character. Savannah's journey shows the importance of staying true to one's own path, even when it means walking away from comfort and acceptance, because integrity and hard-earned purpose matter more than inherited status. The story also models a healthier form of justice. Rather than seeking revenge or public humiliation, Savannah chooses accountability, fair consequences, and the chance for wrongdoers to make things right, demonstrating that true strength often lies in restraint rather than retaliation. Finally, the story emphasizes generational wisdom and quiet mentorship, illustrating how one person who truly believes in you, even without grand gestures, can shape your entire future. It encourages viewers to recognize and nurture those relationships, and to eventually pass that same quiet, steady belief on to others.